want you to close your eyes for a moment. Now imagine that in that instant that your eyes are closed, every single physical constant in the universe changes. The speed of light shifts, gravity weakens, and even the structure of matter rearranges itself at the most fundamental level. But your brain changes with it. Your senses adjust, your cognition recalibrates, and every single interpretive framework that you may know of the universe transforms along with reality itself. Now, open your eyes again. Everything looks exactly the same, right? The walls are still standing, the floor still feels solid, and the people around you appear unchanged. So tell me, how would you ever know that reality had shifted around you? Well, the simple answer is you wouldn't, because if reality could change without us ever even detecting it, then what exactly are we trusting when we say that something is real? Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ngan, and I will be presenting my book, Reality is Not What It Seems, by the renowned author, Carlo Rovelli. Now, keep that question in mind, because I won't answer it yet. Now, before we get into all of this abstract mathematics and deep theory, let's look at how modern scientists describe reality through Schrodinger's theory. You might be wondering, what does this theory even mean, and is it even related to reality that we're speaking about? Well, this equation actually describes how the wave function, denoted by this sign over here, evolves over time. At a first glance, it may appear to be just a technical formula that you just look at and sigh. Well, because its implications are very radical to us, as the wave function does not just simply describe a tiny solid particle moving through three-dimensional space. Instead, it describes a probability amplitude. Envision two doors right in front of you. Two doors that will ultimately decide your fate, life or death. I want you to pick a door. Have you chosen one yet? Because if you chose the left door, then you chose to live. But unfortunately, if you chose the right door, then you chose death. But have you ever wondered what happens in that moment, in that instant where you haven't chosen a single door yet? You haven't gone through a single path yet? Well, this is what Schrodinger's theory is about. In a moment, in a state where you haven't chosen a single state yet, or a subject hasn't hindered a single possible quantum state yet, all possible states exist at the same time. Only when being observed, like choosing a door, life or death, do we yield a definite outcome. Then this means that what is possible comes first, and what is real comes later. What we see as solid and certain is actually just one outcome from many, many, many possibilities. So the world that you see right now may seem distorted, may seem stable and fixed, but all of that is just an illusion. Something only becomes real when something truly happens. So already, we see the first crack in our everyday assumption of reality that is fixed and stable. But if reality doesn't exist in the space that we live in, or the space that it exists in truly, then what kind of space does reality actually exist in? Well, let me introduce to you two topics. One, perceived space, and two, Hilbert space. Now, I know your mind might be swirling right now. What do these topics even mean, and are they even contextually related to the topic that we're speaking about? Well, perceived space can be defined as three-dimensional and intuitive. It is the space in which we move, touch objects, and even locate ourselves. It may seem seamless, stable, and solid. But doesn't that sound familiar? Doesn't it sound like our reality, or possibly what we perceive as our reality? Hilbert space, on the contrary, is an abstract mathematical construction. It is a space in which we cannot just directly experience or visualize ourselves in, but it is the space in which all of the quantum states are fully described and expressed. Now, actually, this doesn't appear only in physics, because it also appears in classic literatures, or even in philosophy, because it also appears in Dante's Paradiso, Nine Spheres of Heaven, where Dante describes reality as not completely separate from each other, but each one a layered expression, and one more deeper and more perfect version of the one before it. What we see is only the outermost layer, which is shaped for human simplicity and clarity, which is real, yes, but only to our human eyes. But it is only constructed by our own human imagination. We can think of this as a layered model of reality. What we see is only the surface layer, which is only shaped for our human simplicity and clarity, and not for knowing the true reality. But underneath that lies an even more deeper complexion that requires a more abstract, more deeper, more defined, and closer to what reality truly looks like. Hilbert's space suggests something similar to that, as Hilbert's space describes our three-dimensional world as only a simplified projection of something far more richer and higher dimensional structure than that of what we see every single day. As we can see here, as Dante's spheres become more refined, as one moves upwards into this abstraction, our physical descriptions become more defined and complete as we move further into this abstract mathematical construction. As we can see here, before we reach the ultimate final purest form, which is reproducing kernel Hilbert spaces, we must reach 1, 2, 3, 4 completely thick layers to actually reach our ultimate reality. Therefore, if the most accurate descriptions of physical systems requires an infinite dimensional structure, then the three-dimensional world of perception cannot be fundamental. Instead, it must be an emergent approximation, a simplified projection of something far, far more complex than that of what we see every single day. This ultimately forms to our final main point of this whole entire presentation. Our reality is not what we perceive it to be, because human knowledge is never a direct encounter with the world itself, but an act of interpretation carried out under permanent uncertainty. Human perception does not open a clear window onto reality itself. It is mediated by our own biological senses, evolved for human survival rather than knowing the real whole truth. Therefore, Carlo Rovelli has once claimed, the world is only a small part of the vast structure of reality. Therefore, what we call reality is not the world as it is, but the world as it becomes intelligible to us humans. Now you might be wondering, do you really need to be smart or have Albert Einstein level of IQ to truly understand what reality looks like? Well, the answer is it's both yes and no. Because to help us understand reality, we must actually have a grasp of multiple contexts, like physics and mathematics, to even geography and English. But no one, and I repeat, no one understands reality beyond the limits of being human, because being human itself is the boundary which is preventing us from knowing the true reality. Now, think of this as, if we find the world may exist in countless complex ways, but our mind can only perceive and interpret the parts it is capable of organizing into meaning. It acts like a filter. It selects, shapes, and simplifies the vast amount of information around us. Let's take an example, a very simple example from nature. A water filtration system that turns dirty and unwashed river water into clean water that is drinkable for us humans. But how can that turn into each stage of the human interpretation and perception? Well, let me show you. As we can see here, the top layer, which represents the pebbles, represents the raw sensory limits, just like our eyes and ears detect only a small range of light and sound, which means that what we see every single day is only a small snippet of the world that is actually real to science. Then the sand later refines this input by actually shattering it even more. Then the charcoal goes even deeper than that, altering any impurities, much like our emotions or even our culture, which distorts our reality. Then the final personal layer, which is the twigs that ultimately act as our representations, identity, or even our personal beliefs, ultimately leading to the idea that our perception is very filtered by each single layer on here. Now, by the time that the water emerges as clean, it appears pure and trustworthy, yet it is no longer the original substance. Yet, in the same way, what we perceive as clear and true is not reality as it is by itself, but the end result of multiple layers of filtration, as you can see here. But then, if our understanding of reality is always shaped by human interpretation, then we must ask ourselves, what happens when that human interpretation itself begins to replace reality completely? Let me introduce to you John Baudrillard's Simulation and Simulacra, where Baudrillard argues that in modern society, representations no longer just simply reflect reality, they begin to create it itself. Media models, simulations, so on, produce what he calls the hyperreal, a version of reality that feels real, yes, but it's constructed, which means that representations no longer just distort reality, they begin to create it itself. Let's take an example. Think of social media. What people share or what influencers share online isn't their true selves. It's a carefully chosen and crafted version that they put out there for others to see. And over time, that version is slowly what others begin to believe about them and what they begin to believe about themselves. We can see this more broadly in examples like how economic models influence how markets behave, or a simple example like Disneyland, where it shows us that reality is always being distorted and completely replacing and creating itself. Or even at the book at hand, Reality is Not What It Seems, where Carlo Rovelli claimed that reality is always shaped and controlled by our own human interpretation. Then it leads to the idea that our reality is of course always shaped by our own perception. Now, we all began with one single assumption, the assumption that reality is always picture perfect, it is completely solid, and that what we are is simply just what is. But then we started to grow and move on to a different branch, a branch that could potentially change everything about what we know today. Science, specifically modern science, that dissolved solidity into a probability. Then philosophy tells us that we never escape that bubble of human interpretation. Now, let's go all the way back to the question that we started with. If reality could change without us ever even detecting it, then what exactly are we trusting when we say that something is real? Because what we experience every single day is not something that we directly encounter with, but something that is hindering what reality truly is. And if the universe's perception is always shifted and mirrored by our own perception, then what we call reality is not something that we truly directly encounter with, and not something formed by our own discoveries, but something that is formed within that boundary of our world and its perception of it. But we never know, because certainty itself might just be the illusion.